All right, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at frequency tables, how to make them, and then how to use those to create a line plot, and then how that line plot can give you some general information about the statistical question that you asked. Remember, when we have a statistical question, it means that it's a question that when you ask different people, you're going to get different responses. So it's not something like what colors are in the American flag. You're going to get the same answers, we hope, every single time you ask somebody. However, a statistical question has many answers. So let's start with this statistical question. Let's look at this one. How many hours did you spend watching television last night? If we wanted to find some general patterns, we could go ahead and we could ask a certain population of people. So let's say, for example, that we start math class and we decide to ask all the sixth graders in our math class how many hours they decided to watch television last night. And we might get a variety of data, and maybe this is the data that we get. All right, you can see that I've already listed the data. So it's, again, pretend I went to each person. I said, oh, how many hours did you watch TV? And I got 0.5. Someone said 1. Another person said 1, 0.5 again, and so on and so forth. This data is good information, but it's not very organized. So one thing that we do to organize our data is we create a frequency table. This is actually something that you could create before you did your asking of your question, because it would help you organize from the beginning. But since we didn't, we're going to do this afterwards. So let's look at how we would make this table. First of all, a table is made up of a series of columns and rows. And when I look at this, I see that there's a couple things I really want to keep track of. I want to keep track of the hours of TV that are watched. So that's going to become a column for me. But I also want to know how many people say it, which could be my frequency. Now, sometimes when we do this, we might even have a column called tallies. We might go through and tally our data, and then that helps us to get our frequency. So we could do that as well. Maybe we'll do a combination of that. So when I look at this, I'm noticing that, and again, if I was doing this before I asked the question, I would just have to kind of come up with a range of what I think would happen. But now that I'm looking at my data, I'm noticing that there is a 0.5, and because there's a 0.5, I think I'm just going to go by 0.5s. So 0.5, 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5, 4, 4.5, and then I would have 5. And my highest data value is a 5, so I'm going to stop there. So I've created my chart. If I wanted to do tallies, I could. And again, I might even have a column called tallies, but since I didn't include that, I'm just going to do that right now. So I see a 0.5, so that gets a tally. I see a 1, that gets a tally. Another 1, second tally. Another 0.5. I see a 2, I see a 3, I see another 2, another 1, another 2, and then I see a 5. Okay, so when I go to do my frequencies, all I really am doing is putting down numbers for those tallies. And I could just use the tallies, but I think most people like a number. So I'm noticing that 2 people said 0.5, which is half an hour. 3 said 1, 0 said 1.5, 3 said 2, and you can see myself just filling these in. And then there was 1, 4, 5. So this becomes my frequency table. It's really just an organization of the data that I've collected. And then this same information will help me to do my graph, which is what I'm going to do next. What I'm going to be working on is something called a line plot. A line plot, you can use graph paper for it, but you don't have to. And it really does consist of first making a line. And it's a line segment. I'm going to do mine above. I wish I had done a little bit more space, but I didn't. And again, I would be using a ruler if I could right now. And this is still an axis. You actually only end up with one axis. It's your x-axis. And you still want to have numbers, and this is going to represent hours of TV. So I would still do a nice little label over here. I can still put a title up at the top. Maybe I'll do it as a question. So my title is How Many Hours Did You Watch TV? Because my x-axis is going to be hours of TV, I have to put my interval sizes on there. Again, an interval is what numbers are you going to graph in, but they have to be consistent. Because I already have that on my table, I can use those exact ones. So everything's going by 0.5, so I'm just going to start with a 0.5 and sort of nicely space these out as evenly as I can. And that's why we said if you want, you can use graph paper to help you do that. And I'm just putting on everything that I need. Okay, and then all we're doing is, and you really don't need a y-axis. You don't even need to write anything on the side. Some line plots will. Sometimes you'll see something over here that might say like frequency, but you really don't have to, because what's going to show your frequency it's a line plot, so we use X's to represent in this case, every student who said an answer. So I looked down and I noticed that for 0.5 there are two people said that. So now I am going to put 2 X's. When you draw your X's, try to make them as evenly sort of same size as you can, otherwise it will distort how you look at it. For 1 it was 3. For 2 it was 0, so 1.5 was 0, so I leave that exactly just by itself. For 2 it was 3 again, so again I'm hoping that that will line up with my other one that has 3. Then it was 0 for 2.5, then 3 had 1. 3.5 through 4.5 had nothing, and then 5 had 1. So this becomes my line plot. Again, what a line plot is, it's representing the exact same data you had for your frequency table. It's just now more visual. It's just a visual representation. And that now allows us to talk about shape. So let's stop and kind of talk about that for a moment. When we talk about shape of data, we're not looking for, our traditional shapes like a triangle or a square or anything like that. We're just looking at, like, what does the data look like? What do we notice? And there's a couple different words we can use when we talk about shape. The first one that I like to talk about is cluster. And cluster just means really is there areas where there is like groups of data, that we notice groups of data. And so when I look at this, I kind of see a cluster here, where I'm going to circle with green. And some people might even extend the cluster a little bit to say, on average, it seems like most of our students are watching somewhere between 0.5 and 2 hours of television. So that would be what we would call a cluster, and you could choose what you want to do. I'm not saying there isn't a right answer, but it depends on how you're interpreting it. So if I was really trying to figure it out, I might say, hey, listen, I don't know what's going on, but most of our students are watching about a half hour to 2 hours of television per night. The other thing you can talk about are gaps. And gaps are really spaces. They're places where you don't see any data. And sometimes these are big gaps and sometimes they're small gaps. I'm seeing a couple gaps here. I see a very small gap here, and I see another small gap here. And small gaps we don't really pay that much attention to. But what I really notice is a really large gap here. There's a large gap between 3 and 5 hours of TV. And if you notice, there's only one person who actually watched 5 hours. And 5 seems pretty excessive for one night. So another word that we sometimes talk about when we talk about the shape is something called an outlier. An outlier is that piece of data that kind of doesn't belong. It's sort of the oddball. That's the way I look at it. It's an outlier. It doesn't mean it's good or bad. Sometimes outliers really can help us if we're looking at like averages. Sometimes it can hurt us if we're looking at averages. But a lot of times it just doesn't fit. And because it doesn't fit, sometimes when we start to really analyze our data, we sometimes don't always account for it, because think of it like if you had grades. If everybody got maybe between 80 and 100%, and then there was one person who got a 20%, that 20% kind of skews the data a little bit. So there's definitely one person who's watching an excessive amount of TV, and we note it, but in terms of the overall shape, I would say what is typical, and that's something that we're going to talk about a lot in this unit, is typical.
Okay, guys, we're going to actually get our writing. We're going to meet on the Suzanne side, and then we're going to come back. He's going to give us some directions. Okay, we're going to get our writing, and we're heading to the Suzanne side for a quick little intro, and then we'll come back when we have time to do the writing. Do we need anything? Yeah, you're writing. You're writing and your writing utensil would be great.